Hello, everyone. So for those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Ainsley. I'm one of the CDRN conveners. And today we're really excited to be hearing from two great speakers on environmental migration and disaster displacement. For a little bit of kind of background context before we actually get started on the meeting, people have always moved in response to environmental triggers. This is not a recent phenomena. But climate change is increasing the severity and intensity of certain hazards and related pressures to move. DRR actually has a role to play in mitigating these pressures at different scales, and also addressing that for the fact that for each group that moves, there's also a group that is forced to stay behind. However, governments are largely underprepared and actually lack the necessary support that they need for such challenges. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our two speakers to you today. We have Elizabeth Ferris, who joins us from the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University, and John Marazita, who is joining us jointly from Cambridge and also the Environmental Mobility Research Unit. So we'll hear a presentation from each of our speakers. And I kindly request that we actually listen to the full presentation and then we'll save Q&A for a short discussion afterwards, once both presentations are done. But I will pass over to John to get started first. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to present on such a timely topic as environmental migration. As many of you know, I'm interested in the broader scholarship of human mobility in island states and have researched a diverse range of labor and climate migration as well as disaster displacement. I'd like to begin by thanking Ainsley and the co-conveners of the Climate Disaster Research Network. I've been with the Department of Geography since January and have thoroughly enjoyed the diverse topics covered in CDRN. It's also a real big pleasure to be here today with Professor Ferris from Georgetown. I work in a very special area. I work between academia, civil society, and policymaking. And much like some of my colleagues in the department, my work has taken me across the Pacific and Caribbean regions. My current research focuses on king tides, a natural hazard event for which I'm quite passionate about. However, today I'd like to give you some insight into the broader context of policy. Trying to change the slide. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So in this presentation, we're going to look at two areas, mainly the emerging Geneva experience related to environmental mobility, and secondly, the Pacific perspective. I know that this is going to be an intense and dry 20 minutes, but I hope to offer some insight into narratives not always apparent within our UK context and give a who's who of policy and research in international organizations that may or may not be useful in your own work. This presentation is less about my work per se and more about my positionality between Cambridge, EMRU, and the government of Kiribati. The point of my talk today is around the following three key messages. First, that environmental mobility is politically charged. Second, that the work of international organizations in Geneva are a driving force behind this evolving topic. And lastly, that although the work in Geneva may give a sense of consensus, there are actually divergent views between both states and even within national contexts. Even the topic is even controversial in some of the Pacific Island contexts that we'll discuss. For the latter, I will review the compelling case of the Central Pacific atoll state of Kiribati, which probably isn't a surprise to most of you. But before we delve into what I believe to be a fascinating topic, I'd like to review with you what I consider to be environmental mobility from this civil society context, as it is not such a commonly used phrase. Let's see, sorry, okay. So within the civil society context, environmental mobility is used as a means to really escape the politicized confines of climate migration, in which diverse stakeholders take emotional stands over what is and is not related to climate change. Instead, I like to mirror the environmental scope of disaster displacement, where environmental refers to the role of natural hazards in human movement. By using the broader terminology researchers and practitioners are able to examine not only the role of climate change mobility, but also such hazards removed from climate change, such as volcanoes and earthquakes, and those hazards in grayer areas such as tropical cyclones. As you know, the natural hazards are normally subdivided into sudden and slow onset natural hazards. Within the mobility lens, slow onset natural hazards mostly fall within disaster displacement, a process that takes place following impact from a natural hazard that causes enough damage so that survivors are no longer able to remain in the same place of residence. When this initial displacement is not quickly absorbed locally, evacuation or ad hoc movement outside of immediate danger may be required, either in neighboring communities or further afield in other regions, islands, states, or even countries. To give an example, following Hurricane Katrina, for instance, which maybe Ellen will correct me if I'm wrong, but some survivors were evacuated as far as Chicago. That's over 800 miles away from New Orleans. Displacement is generally understood to end once the survivors either return to their pre-displacement residence or integrate into another place in which special assistance is no longer needed. Increasingly, there may be a cross-border element to displacement, especially within a Caribbean context where states face limitations in housing displaced survivors. Even the US, for instance, has long offered emergency humanitarian visas within this context. For slow onset hazards, mobility studies remains more abstract and mostly in line with climate change narratives such as sea level rise and increased drought, at least in the Pacific context. As slow onset disasters take place over years and decades, the environmental impacts on mobility are not immediately apparent. In general, it is understood that increased climate impacts leads to devolving livelihoods in which food and water security become increasingly compromised, leading victims to move in search of, well, greener pastures, really. Environmental mobility in the context of slow onset natural hazards is thus not merely environmentally driven, but multi-causal and further compounded by social and infrastructural vulnerabilities, such as in the example of Kiribati that we'll hear about later, unplanned development. The growing threat of natural hazards in line with, for example, the IPCC reports has led governments and stakeholders to take note. Although most action taken is in the hopes of preventing eventual migration, some settlements are clearly too vulnerable and mobility and migration is being considered not only as a response to natural hazards, but as an adaptation. And there has been a shift in focus to relocations, which you'll hear more about from Professor Ferris, as I understand. It is important to note that relocations are not only being considered for remote communities in, for example, the Global South, such as Fiji, but also in the global north and even in metropolitan contexts such as Jakarta. Within the field of environmental mobility, there are a couple of really important numbers that you should consider. One was brought up by Ainsley, the IDMC estimates. The most recent estimate for 2022 is 32.6 million people newly displaced by sudden onset disasters. Second, the World Bank's Groundswell report that estimates that 216 million people will migrate due to environmental impacts by 2050. As climate change increasingly impacts vulnerable areas and environmental drivers of mobility become more pronounced, it's not a surprise that international organizations are taking stock. In the previous CDRN, if you remember, the Sendai framework was discussed. While this is a vital discussion that also relates to environmental mobility, as I'm also attached to the UN Geneva, I'd like to give you more information on the Geneva experience and continue on from this Sendai framework discussion. One of the most interesting shifts towards policy came about in 2012 with the Nansen Initiative. Launched by governments of Switzerland and Norway, the initial goal was to seek a consensus among states as to legal protection of cross-border disaster displacement through a bottoms-up approach that held consultations in key regions, beginning in the Pacific Islands, in Rarotonga, Cook Islands, in May 2013. And within 2 years, by 2015, 109 states had endorsed the agenda for the protection of cross-border displaced persons in the context of disasters and climate change as a direct result of the Nansen Initiative. Following the monumental COP21 in Paris, states moved to establish the Platform on Disaster Displacement, abbreviated PDD, to continue this work of the Nansen Initiative, to continue from where it left off. So PDD is a state-led, it's state-led by a steering group of 18 member states plus the EU, but is more than just policy. It has become a hub of policymakers, civil society, and most important to us, academics. I think as Professor Ferris can attest from the recent PDD Advisory Committee, which we were both attending in Geneva. Due to this unique position, the PDD has played at least some role in shaping not only the field of disaster displacement, but also planned relocation. As PDD mandates have evolved, moving from mere consultations to more tangible projects, partnerships within the UN system have led to some important improvements in data collection that may be of interest to you. Most recently, PDD has worked with the International Organization of Migration, IOM, and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, to improve projection capabilities in the Pacific. However, even without PDD, IOM and IDMC are important sources of data. I recommend that you all check out IOM's Displacement Monitoring Matrix, Displacement, that's not the right abbreviation, it's DTM. IOM's DTM. I'm sorry, I don't remember what it stands for. But DTM and also IDMC's annual grid, which was only released, I believe, last week or the week before. Beyond the technical capacity of PDD, IOM, and IDMC, tangible policy steps have been taken even at the Secretary General level, with the high-level panel on internally displaced persons in 2019, and continue to be supported by the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. And most excitingly for many of us working in the Pacific, the very first Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, Ian Fry from Tuvalu. Although this is widely thought of as a historical step for environmental mobility, among other issues, it remains rather symbolic, as the Security Council is unlikely to take up climate change in the near future, unfortunately. Other up-and-coming initiatives in Geneva include the Climate Vulnerable Forum, for which Kiribati is a signatory. As Geneva moves into a decade of action on environmental mobility, there are a few key names as well that should be taken into account in case you're doing a literature review on this topic. So first, of course, there's Professor Walter Kaling, Special Envoy of the PDD, and a leading academic figure from the field of constitutional law, who is an emeritus with the University of Bern. In geography, there's also Professor Etienne Piguet from the University of Neuchâtel. I recommend checking out his CLIMIC database, an exhaustive collection of scholarship on environmental migration that is often credited with driving the state of the art in environmental mobility. So up to now, I've sort of painted a straightforward approach to environmental mobility, where there is a divergence between slow and sudden onset natural hazards, sudden onset being singularly driven, measurable, and slow onset more of a future problem, and projectable with multiple drivers that in theory should be manageable to some extent. In reality, there can be strong disconnects between various players, resulting in politics of environmental migration, with loaded buzzwords, most notably that of climate refugee and sinking islands. So in this final part of my presentation, if I may, and if I have time, I'm going to pivot away from Geneva toward a context that couldn't be more different. From the mountainous landlocked country of Switzerland, let's move to the low-lying island state of Kiribati in the Central Pacific. So for those of you who don't know, Kiribati, you can see some of the stats on the screen. while I blah, blah, blah along. But it's a country right at the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And while Kiribati has mostly taken a step back from international stage in regards to climate change more generally, in the previous decade, the island state was a poster child for the image of future climate refugees, to be left homeless and stateless by rising sea levels. The charismatic president at the time, Anote Tong, portrayed this very image in the run-up to the very same COP in which the PDD was established, gaining general notoriety in climate change circles. As the former president said at COP21, we are on the front line. We will fail. To further the agenda, Kiribati took steps that filled headlines in major global news sources, and even getting a nod for the Nobel Peace Prize, including the purchase of land in Fiji as a future home for climate refugee, Kiribati, and protection of the Phoenix Island Protected Area, PIPA. Tong also coined the popular term migration with dignity. As Tong's presidency came to an end and the Kiribati chose a new leader, Tong's opponent, Danis Mama, I'm sorry, it's not a very good photo, very good quality photo, but you get the idea, was elected in 2016 and eventually reelected in 2020. Mama's administration has taken a strong stance against Tong's migration with dignity, instead focusing on staying and fighting and taking action against the climate refugee narrative that by the time of Mama's administration had become synonymous globally with Kiribati. The shift in policy from vulnerability to resilience hasn't gone over well in popular media or in international organizations in which the former president remains a dominant figure, often being invited to attend global congresses either along with the president or in place of the current president, and always drawing strong rebuke from the government of Kiribati. What is often forgotten within the international discourse is the viewpoint of Kiribati. And while Tong's message ensued overseas at the time, the local context of climate change awareness parallel was concertedly more short-term than Tong's migration with dignity and climate refugee pleas. And we don't have too much time to go into it. But this is just as a little anecdotal anecdotal piece to support this. You can see it even evident in the language, in the Kiribati word for climate change. Pipitakin Kanwanabong translates to literally to changes in everyday life, rather more short-sighted than planning for a future in a faraway land through migration with dignity. Although there was some awareness of these dual narratives taking place within Kiribati, perhaps more so was in the extended diaspora. And through my time in Kiribati, I've really found very few Kiribati who seriously consider the climate change scenario as a possible outcome for the country. On one hand, identity is embedded in land across the Pacific. On the other hand, there are alternative ontologies, indigenous ontologies resulting from centuries of dependence on the sea. Instead, the dominant sinking island narrative has resulted in an inability to attract development partners, and most importantly, for any least developed country, foreign direct investment, creating a large barrier to development and in turn, an inability to invest in much needed adaptation projects and further cementing dependence on development partners that has spawned discussions on threats to sovereignty in recent years. Nearly a decade after buying land in Fiji, the remote plot of land remains much the same, with the government unable to find any meaningful use for the land, even with the cooperation of larger donor states. As Kiribati pivots toward resilience to the impacts of climate change, along with the Marshall Islands and other countries, there remains not even a regional consensus on climate and migration policy. Kiribati's new policy has left a void in more climate vulnerable messages that have now been filled by Tuvalu, especially, and to some extent Vanuatu, while other states such as regional hegemonies of Fiji and Samoa continue to work within their dominant roles of international organizations, including on the platform on disaster displacement. While I could probably continue elaborating on this topic for the next hour, I hope that my rambling provides some insight into not only the complexity of environmental mobility policy, but also offer some insight into the stakeholders that may be helpful in your work. But before I end my rant for the day, I'd like to take a look at some of the research gaps that overlap both scholarship and the policy world. As with much scholarship in the area of climatology, the past decade focused on quantitative approaches. And while the quantitative approaches have been helpful and necessary to systematically provide evidence, now there is a need to situate that knowledge, to situate those numbers, the story behind the numbers, really. Thus, there's a need for more qualitative methodologies, taking into account local and indigenous knowledge sets. There's also still a lack of longitudinal perspectives, especially from the global south and island perspectives. From a policy view, I expect there to be more calls in the near future for data on both the conflict disaster nexus and, most importantly, to exploring the link between environmental mobility and loss and damages, vital as policymakers scramble to define the legal parameters of funding mechanisms monumentally agreed upon in the previous COP and being discussed in every UN organization, regional body, and elsewhere. So there's a lot to do. I guess we have to get to work. I guess more so after Professor Ferris makes her statement. But thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, John. That was really interesting. And I think we'll hold our questions for you until after Professor Ferris has spoken, but I'll just hand over to you right now, Professor Ferris. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be with you all, and I really enjoyed John's presentation. I think he laid out the big parameters of this emerging field of environmental mobility. I'm going to talk to you this morning for a few minutes about a subset of environmental mobility that people talk a lot about, but there really isn't a whole lot of knowledge in terms of what is going on, what is likely to occur. And again, like John said, really a lack of policy guidance. And that's the issue of, oops, let me move this over, of planned relocations. Sorry. These are photos of Kivalina, Alaska on the one hand, and Ile de Jean Charles, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. Two communities that are talking about planned relocation, the need to do so. Sorry, I can't find my little slideshow here.
Is it down at the bottom?
It is down at the, oh, there it is. Okay, I had to move you. Okay, here we go. All right. These are, two communities where in the process of talking about, or in the case of Ile de Jean Charles, have actually moved. So to put this in context, I'm going to talk about what are planned relocations, some of the experience in developing guidance for carrying these out, and look at the specific case of Ile de Jean Charles, a small community in southern Louisiana that moved just in January 2022 after a very long process as an example of what this means in practice. But, back in 2010, the COP meeting in Cancun came up with its really first statement about mobility as being a form of adaptation to climate change. And they directed attention to three different aspects of climate mobility: climate change-induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation. Well, at the time, there was a general understanding of what displacement is when people are forced to move, and migration when people choose to one extent or another to move, often in anticipation of the effects of climate change. But really not much attention had been paid to this phrase, planned relocation. And the experience we have of planned relocation or moving whole communities really comes from resettlement after development projects, and where the World Bank had taken the lead in supporting these moves when a dam is constructed, for example, and large numbers of people have to be moved. But the experience from these development project resettlement was not very reassuring. In fact, most observers say that most of these resettlement projects left the people who had been relocated worse off than they had been before the move. So this is the guidance that the World Bank came up with for what they call their safeguard policy, saying that displaced persons, people who are resettled, should improve or at least restore their livelihoods and living standards. So this was a little bit of guidance that might be helpful in looking at planned relocations. So planned relocations, refers to the possibility that, some people will be left behind when others migrate in anticipation of the effects of environmental hazards, including, but not only, climate change. Some will be displaced, but others may need assistance to move to some place of safety. So planned relocations can be seen as both a disaster risk reduction and as a means of adapting to climate change. And the idea is that these can occur both after a disaster to prevent people from suffering the effects of future disasters, but also proactively before things get terrible or catastrophic. So this was a little bit of the context. The term planned relocations was used by the COP process, and so I'm using it here. But sometimes these are referred to as relocations, preemptive relocations, resettlement, settlement, coastal retreat, managed retreat. That's a big phrase in the United States right now. Evacuations understood to be more temporary than relocations. Sometimes evacuations lead to more permanent settlement. So a lot of different terms are used, and some of these come with a lot of, we say, political baggage. In the US, for example, the term managed retreat is being used in coastal communities in North Carolina and California and elsewhere. And it brings with it this feeling of our government has given up on us, we're leaving, we're retreating. It's not very much in the American psyche. So a lot of response to the term retreat. So, after this COP10 meeting in Cancun, working with UNHCR, IOM, the World Bank, UN University, and my university at Georgetown, we began a series of expert meetings, beginning first with academics, civil society practitioners, UN folks, looking at the available evidence, holding consultations, a little bit like the platform on disaster displacement, although not as large in all regions, talking with governments. Have you thought about planned relocations? Have you actually carried some of them out? And discovering in the process that there is lots of these planned relocations already going on that hadn't made it into at least not the academic literature. So we then developed some general guidance. What would be some general principles to use in planning out these relocations? So we defined the planned relocation. You can see the definition there. You see it was written by lawyers, a planned process in which persons or groups of persons move or are assisted to move away from their homes or places of temporary residence, settled in a new location, and provided with the conditions for rebuilding their lives. I think until we started diving into this, the idea of planned relocations was really all about logistics. Let's move people, transport them to some place where they'd be safer. But this guidance says, hey, you don't just move people and dump them in a new area. It's the process of really providing the conditions to enable them to settle and to thrive. We only looked at relocations carried out under the authority of states. There are some corporations, for example, in parts of West Africa that have moved their communities or their workers from areas at high environmental risk elsewhere. We only looked at those carried out within governmental policies. We only looked at relocations within national borders. As John alluded to, there's often a lot of talk. Well, if the islands in the Pacific are sinking, they can just move someplace else. And A few governments have been talking about that, but right now that's really not under discussion seriously by anyone. The thought of moving your whole population or parts of your whole population permanently to another state. And we looked at instances of relocations intended to protect people from the risks associated with disasters and environmental change. You know, a lot of planned relocation goes on under the guise of environmental policy or reducing environmental risk, but is often considered as land grabbing, or governments may have other purposes rather than protecting people from moving them elsewhere. So we looked at the planned relocation in the context of natural hazards, not technological disasters like oil spills or chemical spills or nuclear accidents, although we've seen some of that as well, particularly in places like Japan after the 2011 Fukushima disaster. We looked at the movement of people, not things or places. There are cases, for example, where public parks are moved because of the environmental hazards, but we looked at the movement of people, and particularly at the movement of communities or groups of people, not individuals. In some places, again, citing the US, buyouts are used to move people, to encourage people to move from places where they are at risk from environmental hazards elsewhere. People are given cash to buy their homes that are no longer on the market because of the environment, to move someplace else. We looked at permanent, long-term, least long-term relocations, things that aren't intended to be temporary solutions. And we looked at planned and coordinated efforts, not just spontaneous movements of groups of people. So we did an analysis really based on the process used in developing the guiding principles on internal displacement. It has many existing instruments, frameworks, laws, policies, UN guidelines, everything from evictions to World Bank resettlement structures, and came up with overarching principles relating to legal and institutional frameworks, assessing the need, planning. And this, when does relocation end? Is it the moment when people are physically transported, or is it a process of integration or reintegration into their new communities? So some of the examples of the principles developed were planned relocation should be used as a last resort after all other adaptation measures have been tried that would enable people to stay in place. So that's what we said. I've had second thoughts about this, just looking at the experience of some planned relocations where they only occur after all the young, economically active people have left the community, making it more difficult to establish a new community when your average age of people relocated, as in the case of the other Jean Charles, is 67. How do you restart a community? We said that planned relocation should have a human rights framework that safeguards both individual and collective rights. And pointed the attention, it isn't just those who are relocated who are affected, it's those who are left behind, either voluntarily, they choose not to move, or involuntarily, they weren't included in the plan. There are people in the new community to which the relocation is occurring that are affected. And then there are others, maybe a neighboring community that isn't moved, but that sees its property values plummet as a result of the movement of this community. So we said people should be allowed to encourage, promoted to improve, or at least restore their living standards, to minimize the adverse effects on others, to uphold family unity. And we spelled out, what should be included in policy. Who decides? Is it the community itself that decides it's time for us to move, as in Newtok, Alaska? Or is it a governmental decision that, okay, guys, it's too dangerous for you to stay here, we're going to move you all? The whole planning process, and when you dig into this planning process, it's always more complicated than you think. It has to do with social services and education, and hospitals, and care for elderly, and access to cultural property, heritage, cemeteries. And then this thorny issue of how do affected communities participate. It's one of those issues that everyone gives lip service to, but it's very difficult to implement. So we circulated these general principles, and then governments came to us and said, well, this is all real interesting, but it seems quite abstract. How do we implement this? What are some concrete tools? So we developed a toolbox together with governments. The World Bank was really central, other stakeholders, and again, had a series of meetings with governments. What do you need to know in deciding to move? So we focus this around the decision, who decides, the plan, what needs to be included, and measures around implementation. Planned relocations always take much longer than people think, usually 4 or 5 years from the time a decision is made. Well, what happens in the interim? For example, when the decision is made that a community will be moved, does the government have a responsibility to maintain the roads in that original to be abandoned community, to provide fire protection, for example? This was a big issue in New Zealand when people were relocated after the disastrous earthquakes in Christchurch in 2010, 2011, what to do with the land left behind and the few people who chose to remain there in spite of the lack of government services. So we looked at the legal framework. What are the impact on affected populations? Is how do you consult in a meaningful way with affected populations? How do you involve people in the community to make decisions about where we move and what's important, and how should the new society be constructed both physically and socially? Land issues are always, always, always tricky. Questions about who owns the land, who retains title to the land, what happens to the land that's left behind? Are people allowed to go back and visit? These are just a couple of ways. Instead of coming up with the traditional formula of making recommendations to governments, governments should, governments must, we focused on checklists. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about the environmental impact of a new community in the area of relocation? Do your laws, I ask you in the UK, do your laws clearly specify who can make that decision? Is it a national authority, a local authority? To what extent are those institutions representative? And finally, we concluded this is complex undertaking. Relocations in most contexts do not have a great record, should be a last resort. But to enhance those chances of success, there are certain things that can be done. Planned relocations are likely to become much more prevalent in the future as we see the impacts of climate change and other environmental hazards. John referred to the platform on disaster displacement, which carried out this study a couple years ago now, looking at all the cases they could find where there was at least some literature of planned relocations. They came up with 308 cases and found enough information to do in-depth studies of 34. Found that these occurred in 60 countries, mostly in Asia, mostly going from a single point of origin to a single destination. Most of them had experienced multiple hazards, not just one storm, for example. They found very little policy guidance. Fiji is the exception with its 2018 guidelines on planned relocation. They found that in 18 of the 34 cases, people were already displaced. They found they couldn't really distinguish in most cases whether it was a reaction to a disaster or an anticipation. Most of these relocations are pretty close to the original community of origin, from 200 meters to 64 kilometers. Relatively small scale, from 4 households moved in one case to 1,000. Nearly all were movements from rural to rural areas. About half were initiated by the community, and most had some kind of participatory mechanism. So I'm going to close with there's lots to talk about here, but close with the example of Ile de Jean Charles, this very small community in southern Louisiana, an area affected by climate change, but also by oil drilling, natural subsidence, the construction of canals and dikes. You will see that they moved about 40 miles, 60 kilometers away. This is an example of a measure to adapt in place of a home in Ile-de-Jean-Charles, again, this very small community that often suffers the effects of hurricanes as well as slow onset disasters such as erosion and so on. This particular house had been razed 3 times over the years trying to escape the effects of flooding. This was an area that was settled by Native Americans, indigenous groups in the early 1800s. They settled on land that nobody else wanted. And this is also a trend that you see globally, and indigenous groups often living in areas that are environmentally fragile. The island back in 57 was 35 square miles. Now it's less than 1 square mile. They went from 325 inhabitants to a dozen today after the relocation. And as I mentioned, the environmental hazards were partly environmental hazards and partly man-made issues such as canals and so on. This is a photograph of the town of Ile-de-Jean-Charles, and you can see the canals here that have been built over the years, but also just its low-lying nature in the swampy, marshy areas. You can't see very well from this photograph, but here's a photo of the land bridge that connects, again, this is the community of Ile-de-Jean-Charles with the mainland of Louisiana. And over the years, many people would use that bridge to go to work on the mainland. But then when hurricanes happened, just after the hurricane in 2021, the bridge would be washed out. And the cost of maintaining the bridge became very, very high. Indeed, one of the reasons the state of Louisiana decided to undertake this planned relocation. But it also meant that, people who were working on the mainland and couldn't get to work eventually decided to move to the mainland to be sure of their livelihoods, leaving this much older population in Ile-de-Jean-Charles. So I want you to think about this. This small community got a grant of $48 million from the US government, which saw it as a model for carrying out planned relocations. $48 million to relocate 35 families. This was about 100 people. People were given new homes with mortgages. They weren't allowed to sell their homes in the first 5 years. If they remained in the new community, they had clear title to the land. The government decided to make no improvements in the community of origin. So once they left Ile-de-Jean-Charles, they weren't going to provide upkeep to the bridge, for example, or provide public services like police or fire protection. This seems like a relatively small number of people, but it turned out to be enormously complicated, in part because of the presence of 2 different indigenous groups among these, remember, only 35 families, who had different visions for how this relocation was to work. The indigenous group saw it as an opportunity to bring their much dispersed tribes together. So they wanted to include lots of people who moved to the mainland over previous decades in the relocation effort. The state of Louisiana said our charge is to move the residents of the island to some place where they're safer. So there are a lot of tension and concern about indigenous rights in this whole discussion, and lots of hard feelings that still remain. After the decision had been made to move, but before the relocation took place, Hurricane Ida struck in 2021 that destroyed almost all the remaining homes. As of August last fall, 37 people have moved. They still have concerns with, hey, we got this new house, but we can't afford the insurance. These are very low income populations. So anyway, this is just a brief overview of some of the problems that have occurred in one planned relocation, one that's been extensively documented, one that had an academic advisory group. I served on that group for several years, illustrating the fact that planned relocation is always complicated and a lot of thought needs to go into it. It drives me crazy when I hear people just throw off this phrase, oh, people can move if conditions get too bad. It is never that simple. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Ferris, for a really interesting talk. And